Thank you, Nan. It's a pleasure to be here. So the motivation of this book and this research goes back to 2008, is a fundamental question for Europe and the West, and that is the degree to which Muslims can integrate into Christian heritage societies. In this research, we basically ask two questions. Do Muslim immigrants face greater barriers to social and economic advance in Europe than if everything about them were the same, but they were not Muslims? In other words, can we identify a Muslim effect purely because of religious difference? And if so, what are the mechanisms? Why should we care? I think that's becoming increasingly obvious. In 2008, when we started this, we had to justify the attention we were paying to this issue. But the relationship of discrimination, unemployment, and criminality is pretty clear, and integration failure, to the extent to which it does fail, undercuts democratic and egalitarian traditions. And I would add to that and emphasize that in France especially, the Republican ideology which pervades the society is one in which all citizens are to be considered equal. And when there is systematic discrimination for a group because of some ascriptive characteristic, it's a fundamental threat to the Republican ideals in France. Furthermore, the far-right political response to Muslim integration threatens Europe's social solidarity and its associated benefits that accrue to all citizens. The extent to which people are considered others and not deserving of social benefits, everybody suffers. So these are questions which have immense implications for you could call it the social democratic compact in Europe. But can religious-based integration failure of Muslim immigrants be measured? And this is the fundamental social science question which we had to address before we actually engaged in any research. The issue is, the question is beset by confounds. Muslims in France came from secular authoritarian states in regions where democratic institutions are absent. So it could be the discrimination they face, if they face discrimination, is due to the environment from which they came and the political cultures of the environment from which they came, rather than the fact that they're Muslims. Moreover, they came to France and in Europe in large numbers just before the collapse of the industrial labor market. Unlike earlier immigrant waves, they came just at the wrong time. They were brought into these banlieues and these bidonvilles, industrial bidonvilles, at a time when the industrial, sort of the Rust Belt industrial complex was just about to collapse. They had, you could say, public housing, which was relatively cheap, but no jobs around them. So it couldn't be the secular authoritarian states from which they came, or it could be that they came more or less at the wrong time from the point of view of economic success. Many came from colonies whose citizens were oppressed by the host country, leaving a legacy of hostility, especially in France, where the greatest number came from Algeria, where colonialism yielded torture by the French and terror by the Arabs, leading to conflictual historical memories. It could be the historical memories of the FLN rather than anything about Islam, which drives the factors that may make higher barriers for Muslims to integrate in labor markets. Standard statistical tools in social science have consequently not succeeded in identifying religion as presenting a special problem for societal integration, especially in France. So the key identification strategy, in order to estimate the barriers to labor market success based on religion, we need to find an immigrant group that is alike in all respects to a Muslim group, but isn't itself Muslim. As I said, there are problems in relying on cross-national data sets, there are confounds, and ethnographies of the banlieue in Paris tend to have a bias which we call a selection bias, because if you study the situation in the industrial suburbs where clearly there is lack of hope and lack of jobs, you're missing a large population of people who successfully moved out of those banlieues and living in the arrondissement, a single-digit arrondissement, having success. So in other words, ethnographies that just go to the places where failure occurs is not really measuring the degree to which failure occurs if you're not looking at the successes. So our solution to the problem of ethnographic inference and the problem of confounds in cross-national data sets was to look at two small groups from southwestern Senegal, the Jolas and the Serres, who came to France in large numbers due to droughts in Senegal in the mid-1970s. And what distinguishes these two groups from other groups in Senegal is there is a significant percentage of Christians or Catholics from these groups. More or less, the jihadists in the 19th century and the evangelical Christians in the late 19th century came to the southwestern Senegal more or less at the same time and did their conversion. The Christians brought the Serres and Jolas into the palm oil and palm wine trade, and the Muslims brought them into the peanut trade, groundnut trade. So they were more or less equal peasant communities with Christians and Muslims coming to France. And so we were able to look at three groups in our analysis: the SMs, the Senegalese Muslims, all Serres and Jolas; the Senegalese Christians, the SXs, and that is the Serres and Jola Christians; and the FFF. Those are people of three generations of parents and grandparents who were born within the hexagon. And the question is, do the FFF discriminate against the SM more than they discriminate against the SX? And the extent to which there is a difference, we could say, attribute to that or identify that to a religious effect. So the first step in the analysis is to establish whether there is discrimination. And for that, we engaged in a well-known protocol called a CV experiment. And what we did in the CV experiment was we created three fictional CVs, one for Khadija Diouf, one for Marie Diouf, and one for Aurélie Menard. And then we went to the Pôle Emploi, the employment site, official employment site of France, and sent randomly to employers. Half of them got Khadija Diouf and Aurélie Menard, and half of them got Marie Diouf and Aurélie Menard, because if we sent Khadija and Marie to the same firm, they would know they were being tested with exactly the same qualifications. The names were different. Khadija is Muslim, Marie is Catholic, Aurélie is close to a secular name as we could find. The past positions that Marie had worked as an administrator for Secours Islamique, which is basically the Islamic charities. Marie worked for Secours Catholique or Caritas, and that is Catholic charities, whereas Aurélie worked for secular firms. Khadija was a volunteer for Secours Musulman, and Marie for Secours Catholique. And what did we find? We found that, that Khadija got 2.5 times fewer callbacks for interviews than did Marie. It was a large and significant effect, which can only be attributed to the identification of the applicant as a Muslim as opposed to a Christian. Race was controlled for, both Africans, and education was controlled for, zip code was controlled for, and everything else was controlled for except for the identification of religion, which is a pretty large effect of discrimination in the labor market. And then what we did, and I'll explain this survey in a couple of more slides, but I want to get this out early. We wanted to estimate the implications of this discrimination. We did a large N survey of second-generation Jolas and Serres in France, 511 of them. I'll describe the sample later on. But in the very end of the survey, we asked our subjects of this survey what the household income was. And controlling for first ancestor that came to France, the degree of education of the first ancestor that came, and a variety of other factors such as age, On average, the Muslim households were earning 400 euros a month less than the Christian Sarah and Jola households, which is about 15% of French average income, which is a gigantic effect. So the search for mechanisms, the CV experiment taught us that there was discrimination, but not why. The survey taught us that the income effects of discrimination were likely to be substantial. Now, we want to know the individual mechanisms that drive human resources employees to say yes to Maria, but no to Khadija. Is this discrimination rational? Is it based on inferences about unobservables that are likely to influence job performance of applicants? Or is it a matter of taste, that the French are willing to pay a cost in firm profits just to, because of a distaste of having to work with people who are Muslims? So we wanted to get the mechanisms that are driving this, because unless we know the mechanisms, remedy becomes a matter of guesswork. So, the research interventions. I already mentioned the large N survey with 511 Sarahs and Jolas recruited through cell phones and face-to-face through chain referrals. Basically, we gave a survey firm the most common 50 surnames of Sarahs and Jolas, and they went through internet chat rooms to get contacts with them. They had 6,000 names, and they had to go through them to get basically the 500 quota that we set, enabling us to do basic statistical analysis. There were 339 SMs, 127 SXs, which is about the percentage of these two populations in France itself. Then we ran a set of experimental games in the 19th arrondissement of Paris, which is about as international arrondissement as you could find, and so it wouldn't be unusual to see Africans mixing or being in the same space as non-Africans. It's an environment we wanted not to give away what we were trying to examine. We told people for these experimental games that we wanted to know how French people dealt with risk and with money, and this would be part of an international examination of risk-taking, which is true, but not the whole truth. Those games that conducted in 2009 were 8 sessions each with 10 subjects for each session from a randomized set of FFF players chosen by a random mechanism by hanging out in front of the metro stations of the 19th arrondissement under a certain algorithm so that we would recruit FFF in proportion to the population around each metro station. 8 sessions with 10 subjects from a randomized FF players, and we recruited them specially, not randomized, SX and SM players through a different set of networks. In 2010, we did some follow-up experiments. We played, I'm going to talk about 5 of the games that we played or organized. A speed chatting game, a voting game, a trust game, a dictator game with a strategic dictator game, and a names game. But I will explain how these games work in the course of the analysis. And then we engaged in 40 ethnographies of Jola and Sarah's, 20 Christian and 20 Muslim, where we spent a couple of days just asking about the immigration experience so that we get richer material than you can get from a large N survey. So we used large N surveys, experimental games, and ethnographies to answer the question, why yes to Maria and no to Khadija? So the 4 core findings on mechanisms. The FFF, despite being radical secularists, that is, in self-conception, condition social behavior on religion. It's a surprise to them. 2, rational Islamophobia due to different values on gender and secularism, in a sense, are unobservables on a CV, but inferred from the general population of Muslims in France. And this drives a view of HR folk that any particular Muslim would have features of the generalized Muslim population, which might hurt the esprit de corps of the corporation. Third, there's a strong non-rational Islamophobia, unprovoked deficit in altruism, and a threshold effect, the belief that if there's more than one Muslim, there's going to be hell to pay. Fourth, an equilibrium sustains this discrimination by the FFF and alienation by the SM. And once you think of it as an equilibrium, the question of undermining it becomes even more problematical than just saying one group is guilty. So mechanism one, religious homophily in France. One of the games we played in these groups of 10 was speed chatting, which is like speed dating. Everybody met half of the players of the groups of 10 and had 4 minutes to converse with them. And in this game, we rewarded with €1 per correct guess of a questionnaire of every person they met. So they got to know people. They got to know people in their group. And then after they got to know the people in the group, we said each group is going to have a team leader elected by all the people that speed chatted with them. We called this a voting game. And the team leader would distribute €30 in any way she or he wanted, keeping it all to herself or himself, or dividing it amongst the people in the constituency. The players, largely driven by the choices of FFF, conditioned their vote. The best predictor of who they would vote for was religious similarity. If in a voter-candidate pair, there was a 17% likelihood of a positive vote if a different religion, a 30% likelihood if voter and candidate share a religion. No other social predictor, gender, race, age, education, or income, predicted who would be voted as leader. But religion was the only social factor which explained, which helped to predict, and we see here the coefficient of a different religion is pretty strong, and no other predictor is statistically significant. We derive from this something that is unusual, and I think the first ones to show it, that the French believe that they are radically secular, but they condition their behavior on religion. It's something like Alsace-Lorraine in the 1970s, that you should never speak of it, but think of it all the time. You never speak about religion, but it guides your behavior. So, in fact, the FFF do condition their social behavior on religion. Second, there is a degree of rational Islamophobia due to different values on gender and secularism. In interesting sociological research amongst HR, human resource managers in a wide number of firms, sociologists Buzar and Buzar find that different religious norms freak out human relations managers. They worry about Ramadan fatigue and work efficiency. They worry about prayer obligations disrupting normal work hours. They worry about food restrictions prohibiting commensality and undermining that esprit de corps. And again, it comes up. I will emphasize this. These cases are extremely rare. I'm going to get to this later, but I want to emphasize it now. The cases are extremely rare where Muslim workers, in fact, engage in some of these behaviors. But when one of them engages in such a behavior, it pervades the whole society as a general effect of the whole population. So it has, in a sense, it's unobservable whether a Muslim, based on the CV, will, in a sense, come to work in a very highly skilled job, not having slept the night and not having eaten. So this is something that is rare, but a powerful image in the minds of HR managers. And also, it's, in a sense, rational, in a sense, it's based on beliefs, or over-exaggerated beliefs, I will say, but based on beliefs. Moreover, the FFF sees laïcité as the freedom to practice in the private sphere. But they see many of these activities as Muslims undermining this view of laïcité by practicing religion in the public sphere. So this is, in a sense, different religious norms which drive the HR managers to discriminate, even though those activities or those propensities would not be seen on a CV. This is data basically saying from our survey about the religious norms of the SMs versus the SXs, and we see in all of these cases, and most of them significantly so, that the Muslims are much more, bring much more religious in practice and religious in belief than the SXs. And the differences in this last column are significant. Second is gender norms. What we see from World Value Survey, it's not our particular research, throughout the Western Christian and Muslim world, support for gender equality, approval of homosexuality, approval of abortion, and approval of divorce. The Western Christian respondents are significantly more gender equality or promotion of women rights than our Muslim respondents. And I would say when I gave the initial results in talks before groups in these ZUS areas, the Zone Urbaine Sensible in France, I was approached or almost attacked by FFF women of my age, saying we spent 50 years of our political career fighting for gender equality, and you're pushing for greater equality for Muslims is going to undermine this. So it's a belief that the gender views of Muslims will have a profound influence on the achievements of people seeking gender equality. So, in our particular experiments, we ran a dictator game. This is the whole group of 10 for each session. We're given a set of pictures. I'm not going to get this. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 pictures. And for each picture, going one by one on the screen, they were given €5 to their account. And they could give 0 to any picture on the screen and keep all 5 for their account. Almost nobody does that anywhere in the world. Economists have never been able to explain that. You could give 1, 2, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now, half of the groups saw her as Khadija, the other half saw her as Josephine. Similarly, with him, half of the groups saw him as Michel. When they saw him as Michel, they saw her as Khadija. When they saw him as Abu Bakr, they saw her as Josephine. And the question is, will the players be more generous to the Muslims or to the Christian guys? We have the two clear FFF. I'm not going to get this. Sylvie and Jean-Marc, and then these two ambiguous cases. I'm going to tell you about George Mohammed if I have a few moments, because he was the most unusual of our players. For these people, except for Abu Bakr and Khadija, we recruited them the same way we recruited our players. We gave them €5 for use of their picture, and then a promise that any money donated to them in the Dictator Game would go to them as their money, as required by the ethics boards in American and I think European universities as well. So what did we find? We find several things, but for purposes of gender, what we find is that for the male donations to co-ethnics, this is the average amount given from 0 to 5, that the SM give more to males, far more to males than to females, whereas the SX gives more to females than males, and the FFF give more to females than males. This is male donations to co-ethnics, and this is male donations to the rooted French FFF recipients. Again, the male SMs give less to the women, whereas the SXs give more to the women, and the FFF gives more to the women. That's the fundamental results. Interesting enough, for female donations to co-ethnics, the SM women give far less to women than they do to the men, whereas the SX women give more to the women and the FFF give more to the women. But the SM women, even though they give more to the male SMs, they give more to the female FFFs. I don't have a great interpretation of that. The real important finding here is that the SMs, males, systematically discriminate against the females in donations in the Dictator Game. So that's the rational Islamophobia based upon beliefs due to different values on gender and secularism and how that might pervade their behavior in the labor force. But there's a strong national, non-rational component to the Islamophobia, an unprovoked deficit in altruism and a threshold effect. And I will look at both of them in the coming slides. The first game we played when the group of 10 arrived is a simultaneous trust game. And the 10 people are sitting in a kind of ante-room reading magazines where we didn't allow them to chat with each other until the speed chatting game that came later. And then we called them by pairs. One was called the sender and the other was called the receiver. And the sender was given a €3 allocation for her or his account and could send 0, 1, 2, 3 by marking on a piece of paper, not seen by the receiver, that would be put into the receiver's account. Simultaneously, the receiver can return 0, 1/3, 2/3, or all of what was received back to the sender. However, the amount of the sender was tripled and put into the receiver's account. So if the sender sent 0, it would be tripled and the receiver would have 0. If the sender sent 3 and it was tripled, the receiver would send 9. If there is high levels of trust, the sender should send 3 and get back 2/3, and both of them gain. That would be, in a sense, the high trust outcome. But the way we set up the game is, since the receiver doesn't know if she or he will ever play that game again with the sender, why not pocket it all with no loss? So we think the amount sent by the sender is based on trust. That is, trust to the degree to which the receiver will send back. And if you really trust that receiver, you will send all 3 of your euros and hope to get 2/3 back at least. Even 1/3 back would be equal to keeping it all to yourself. The amount returned to the sender is basically a matter of taste. It's pure altruism, because you could keep it all. So what do we find? The FFF show no difference in trust. They send 250 euros on average to the SXs and 2.48 euros to the SMs. There's no sense that no belief that the SMs will send back less than the SXs. Trust is the same. However, the FFF show significant difference as receivers. They send on average 48% of the money they gain to SX senders, but only 39%, significantly less, to SM senders. In a complementary game, we showed that FFF do not hold different beliefs about how much an SM and SX would send to them. And so we're sure that this is a pure matter of taste, that they just feel more comfortable being altruistic to the SXs than the SMs. The trust game results show that the FFF are less altruistic towards SMs compared to matched XXs, with no expectation that SM are treating FFF less well than SXs. So it's not just xenophobia we then find. Why isn't it just xenophobia? I'll get to that in a second. So these are when they come in, the groups to be registered for the days playing games, everyone puts his first name on a card on their lapels. And it was pointed out to us that, in fact, every single SX player had a name recognizable to French people as French. And none of the SMs. So it could be just xenophobia that was driving this. So what we did is we ran a names game the following year in the 19th arrondissement and paid our respondents a prize if they correctly guessed the religion of each of these players. And we took the names that were that more than 50% of our respondents said were Muslim as Muslims. We called them SMMs, Senegalese Muslim with Muslim names. And we called the other half SMAs, Senegalese Muslims with African names. And we found almost the entire effect of lower altruism was towards the SMMs rather than the SMAs. So in a sense, the SMAs did just as well as the SXs. And this was a Muslim effect rather than a xenophobic effect. So the first non-rational source was basically a matter of taste. Less altruism towards people who are identifiable as Muslims. The second one is a threshold effect. In each of the 8 sessions, we had a different mix of SMs and SXs. So on average, there were 6 or 7 randomly chosen people from the 19th arrondissement, and the rest were populated by some mix of SMs and SXs, different for each of the sessions, or largely different, or randomly different for each of the sessions. The FFF subjects would therefore be exposed to different degrees, what we call salience of religious difference for each session. Some sessions were clearly populated by a number of Muslims, and some were populated by not so many Muslims. As more SMs are in the session, in the very final game, this Dictator Game, FFF gets less generous to the SMs with no such effect with decreasing number of SX in the session. Let me show you the results. Before I show you the results, I have to tell you about the Minister of Interior under Sarkozy, Brice Hortefeux. He was caught during a UMP summer school session in Aquitaine having a conversation with one of the students in the break of the session, which was basically training UMP cadres. And he was having an argument, a discussion, a political discussion with this Hamid, and it was being YouTubed, now, unbeknownst to Minister Hortefeux. And someone intervened, that is one of the deans of the school, and said to Hortefeux, why do you want to deport so many Muslims? Can't you see how rational and how cultured they are? And he came back, first said, which isn't on this slide, well, this guy, Hamid, wasn't to prototype. And then he said, when there's one Muslim, that's okay. When there's lots of them, there are problems. We want to call this, what we report now, the Hortefeux effect. See if we can make him famous for... So, what we do is comparing contributions to guises in the Dictator Game. I've already explained this setup. And what we find is that when, this is, again, the average donation, when there's one SM in the room, this is how much the FFF gives to SMs. When there are 2 SMs in the room, this is how much they give. When there's 3 SMs in the room, it goes down. It's a monotonic decrease in the amount given to Muslims, conditioned on the number of Muslims in the room. There are all 10 of them in the room with their private pads. This is when there's 1 SX there. When there are 2 SXs there, it's still the same. 1 SM to 2 SM. With the Christians, it goes up here, but down here. There's no systematic difference of the number of Christians in the room in FFF donation behavior. But there's a systematic, we call this threshold, or I hope you'll think of it as an Hortefeux effect. With more Muslims in the room, it gives a sense of cultural threat. So we believe, contra Becker and Stigler, if you know their famous paper on matter of distaste, that there is an accounting, it's called no accounting for taste, that there is an accounting for distaste. A small cultural difference between minority and majority can lead to exaggerated fear that growing numbers of the minority would undermine a majority culture. The result is often conspiracy theories that exacerbate that fear. And this we call, this exaggeration is what we call a matter of fear, and a matter of fear which is not rationally based, but it has an irrational component, similar to the Anglican fears of the Popish plot in 17th century England, and the Front National anti-Islamic fear tactics. And those of you who haven't read Michel Houellebecq's novel, Soumission, will see a perfect example of, in a sense, an increasing number of Muslims in the society, and suddenly Ben Ali wins the presidential election and turns the Sorbonne into the Islamic University of Paris. So there's a popular press conflating Salafi jihadists with typical French Muslims, even though Salafi jihadists are the tiniest percentage or minority in the country. So we've gone through three of the mechanisms. The French conditioning their behavior on religion, a rational component to the Islamophobia, a non-rational component, that is the matter of taste. And now I want to describe the data showing how this becomes a kind of deficient equilibrium or a vicious cycle of discrimination. The discriminatory equilibrium, based on the survey and experimental results, the following tables will reveal, compared to the matched SX, the SMs are more distrusting of French institutions than the SX. The SM do not think French institutions or FFF treat all citizens equally. The SM have a greater attachment to the home country, and SM have less attachment to the host country and its culture. So, in our survey, we ask about the level of distrust or trust in French institutions, and an answer of 4 means the respondent distrusts entirely the institution. A 1 says they trust the institution entirely. We ask the respondents about trust in the school system, in the police, in parliament, in the administration, in justice, in the unions, and in firms. And in all cases, the SM have higher numbers, there's higher levels of distrust in French institutions than the SXs. Yes, and excellent point. Let me take a quick aside on that. In a study I did with Yann Algan and Camille Aimé on the HLM, we have data on social relations in every single public housing establishment or unit in France. And the greater the levels of heterogeneity in these public housing units, you'll have poorer public goods, more likely elevators will break down, more likely garbage won't be collected, higher levels of vandalism, more graffiti, more garbage thrown everywhere. So higher levels of fractionalization or heterogeneity of the populations within these HLM, the worse the public goods. But when we ask about the degree to which people are physically insecure, it's the same. So you might say the police, even though they are failures in many regards, treat the Muslims and the Christians equally badly. They don't discriminate. They come into Saint-Denis like stormtroopers, and they can't really discriminate very well. There's a well-received book by a writer for the Financial Times that writes about the discrimination in France, and he uses incidents in the bidonville, in the banlieue, as all examples of the Muslim threat. And sometimes it's Zaïrois who are being, who are doing the bad stuff, and he treats them as Muslims, even though the probability of being a Muslim from Zaire is pretty low. So, SM more distrusting of French institutions than SX. Second, SM do not think French institutions or FFF treat all citizens equally. Again, this is our sample. So 1 means the institution treats all equally. 4, institution does not treat all people equally. And here we have significant results for the police, for immigration authorities, for the prefecture, for justice, for the school, and also for the Pôle emploi. They have good reason for doing it for the Pôle emploi, given the fact, what we know from the CV experiment. But again, they believe that they're getting unequal treatment by French institutions. And the equality is not expected. So we did one clever thing. I say clever because it came from my co-author. After the Dictator Game, the only time we ever outrightly lied to our subjects, and we had to get special approval, we said we were going to choose out of a hat one of the 10 people in the room, and that person is going to be the model. It always was person A4, which is always someone who was FFF. And then we asked the other 9 people in the room to guess how much that person gave to each of the players, with a 30-euro reward, for coming closest to the choices of choices of that model. And the idea was to see if the SXs or SMs thought that the model, the FFF, would give less to Christians or give less to Muslims. So with controls, SM expect basically 1.06 as €1.06, which is a lot from the fact that the distribution basically is 2 to 4 that they give to the players. €1 difference is very, very large here. SM expect €1.06 fewer to the SM guys. That is, going back here, if we're comparing what they expect the FFF person to give to Michel compared to what they thought they would give to Abu Bakr, or what they thought they would give to Khadija versus what they thought they would go to Josephine. So we're keeping the face completely matched with a major effect on what SMs thought the FFF would be giving to each of the faces. There was no such effect for the SX guys. They saw no difference. That is, no discrimination for people who are SX. SM have greater attachment to home country. So again, on our survey, we asked a range of questions about their attachment to the home country. I want to bring up 2 of these. Remittances, whether respondents sends remittances to Africa, significantly more. This is the second row, significantly more for the Muslims. And I want to emphasize that because although Muslims on average gave far less in dictator games to any of the guises, people could say, well, Muslims are just less generous people. But no, they're far more generous sending back to their home area than they are to these anonymous faces. And we would say that their sense of their own community that deserves money is not these anonymous faces from France, but to relatives or other people in their kinship groups in Africa. The other key one, and French sociologists, pointed to us that the best indicator of attachment to home country versus attachment to host country is where you expect to be buried. And there was a massive difference in expected to be buried in Africa for the Muslim population as compared to the SXs. So in a sense, the SMs become more attached to their home country. I want to emphasize we see this as part of an equilibrium. It's not that they're naturally attached, but given the situation they face in the country, they orient their behavior more to a future in their home country rather than the host country. And we see the same thing if we look at it in reverse. The SM have less attachment to the host country and its culture. So sympathy towards the French people. And we ask here, which is an interesting one, hide father. Do you approve of a man of Senegalese origin who hides from his son's friends to help him pass as French? Which is interesting. How much would you approve your kids' behavior trying to pass if in fact their skin is light enough or something that, and not show their father? As an immigrant kid myself, not letting my friends see my parents was an important part of my strategy of hiding my background. So here we see that the Muslims are far less acceptance of the passing strategies of their kids than are the Christians. On most of these measures, what we did, we found that third generation, we had some third generation SM and SX, are more distant from the SX than the second generation, suggesting that this equilibrium of the second generation is not going away over time. In fact, it is what Avner Greif calls self-reinforcing. It's getting more powerful over time, the difference between the Christians and the Muslims, or SMs and SXs. So when it comes to importance of God, on the question of men, when jobs are scarce, should have job preferences. When it comes to sending remittances to Africa or owning a home in Africa, the differences are significantly different for the third generation compared to the second, except for the speaking of French. Again, most of the folk who came from Senegal had rather functional French of the first migrant when they came to France. So it's not too surprising that there's no great difference in the mastery of French in terms of integration. So there's a self-reinforcing discriminatory equilibrium in France in regard to its Muslim population. And this is the way the equilibrium sort of works. The FFF exhibit both rational as well as exaggerated non-rational behavior in interaction with SMs, as well as lack of altruism. The SM, perceiving more discrimination against them in France, separate more from the host society than do the matched SXs, and both SM and FFF act in ways that reinforce beliefs that separation of the two groups will persist. Beyond France, we do some less well-identified survey analysis to see how broad this is, allowing us to call the book Christian Heritage Societies and not just France. We look at migrants across Western Europe. We look at Christian Muslims Bosnians versus Muslim Bosnians, also with Lebanese Muslims and Christians, and find again Christians are less discriminated against than matched Muslims, as matched in terms of background conditions. So we do this as well. We do this as well in the Detroit metropolitan area, a University of Michigan study of the largest diaspora Arab community in the world in the metropolitan Detroit. And again, controlling for background conditions. The Muslims do significantly worse, face higher levels of discrimination, have higher levels of alienation than matched Christian Arabs. When we look at the Multicultural Policy Index, despite interesting work by people like Will Kimlicka and others, the difference disfavoring Muslims is exacerbated in Western European countries that are more multicultural in policy. The more assimilationist the policy, the less the degree of difference between the Muslims and matched Christians. Since France today is more assimilationist than on average, the effect there of Muslim discrimination perhaps is a lower bound for all Western European and North American states. To read more, the book has just come out, Why Muslim Integration Fails in Christian Heritage Societies. Thank you for your attention.